And we've got an interesting subject, difficult subject. The title of the panel is My Country First, Anti-Globalism and the Questioning of Collective Action. If you look at all the great challenges that we're facing in the world today, cyber attacks, data privacy, climate change, refugees, a lot of these are issues that cross borders. And yet the challenges are all interconnected, and global cooperation is more important than ever in order to face them. But at the time that we're living in is a time of rising nationalism, a rising questioning of the point of globalization or the fairness of globalism, and multilateralism is being rejected. Discontent with institutions and elites are on the rise, and so is nationalism and protectionism. So this is all bringing into question not only efforts to strengthen future global governance, but also the existing rules and mechanisms of the world order today. So we're going to try and answer questions about what the cause of this tension is, how we can change this narrative, do we need to change it, and how do we take into account these different voices of discontent about globalism. We've got three speakers today in three different parts of the world, all of them distinguished thinkers and prolific writers, and it's a real pleasure to have them here with us. On my right, we have Luis Rubio, who is the chairman of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations and the think tank Mexico Evalùa, and a contributing editor of La Reforma. Julius Krein from the US is the editor of the journal that he founded, American Affairs, and is a former Trump supporter turned critic, I think that's fair, and a writer on conservative ideology and nationalism. And on my left is Igor Yurgens, who's come to us from Moscow. He's the chairman of the Institute of Contemporary Development, a Moscow think tank, and at one point was economic advisor to President Medvedev. So I think we're going to start by trying to define what we're talking about here. What is the problem? What is globalism and what is anti-globalism? And I think I'm going to ask Julius if you will start by coming in on that. What is the problem, and how far is this an issue that is affecting efforts to mobilize a collective action and deal with some of the issues that I've just been talking about?
Thank you. I would define the problem in somewhat different terms, mainly that the order, if you want to call it that, constructed after the Cold War is crumbling. It no longer works to address a multitude of issues around the world. Speaking with regard to the U.S. in particular, there have been stagnant wages for 30 plus years, a vast deindustrialization of the country, an overbearing financialization of the economy, and I don't think one even has to elaborate the foreign policy mistakes. The chief beneficiaries of this order have been those who have more or less rejected the ideology behind it and intelligently pursued their own national interests. And the fact is that the material basis for what you call globalism, or whatever one wants to call it, simply doesn't exist. And the issue is either we can address these problems and recognize them, or we can continue to kind of dwell in an ideology that really no longer has any solutions to offer.
Luis, I think you might have some thoughts in reaction to that comment.
Well, I think it all depends on what vantage point one takes. If one asks a peasant in the 1960s in China and what has happened in the last 30 or 40 years, that person has come out from poverty and has become one of the biggest beneficiaries of this. So surely the globalization has meant, not as an ideology, but simply as a technological movement, as a change in the patterns of production, has radically altered the way reality has spread out benefits. So surely the old beneficiaries, the old unions in some European nations, in the US and the like, have lost out, whereas some people in the rest of the world have greatly benefited. So I don't believe that there is an issue, there is a problem, of course, And I think we should find the right diagnosis for what the problem is, and in order to try to address it. Seen from those that have lost out and have been left without the skill set, the ability, the training, the education to come out of it, clearly that explains why many nations have been delivering leaders that want to turn the clock back. I don't believe we can turn the clock back, however. The question is, how do we face up to the structural challenge that this entails?
Should we try and make a distinction between the anti-globalization or globalization that you've just been talking about and globalism or anti-globalism? Igor, how do you see the interplay between those two phenomena?
First of all, I'm closer to Luis than to Julius because, you know, I was born in '52 and I lived through, for example, Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were at the worst times, on the brink of the nuclear war and all of that stuff, and we managed to build up different regimes of global governance from here, from those times to here. So from our vintage point, the world became better, and it's not a just and fair place to live. But when was that? So and now we face the situation when the country challenges and even regional challenges cannot be solved only on the regional or country level, and we have to go to a new concept of multilateral or global governance. And we are very close to that. In fact, we are living in this situation. At the moment we talk, about $1 trillion already changed hands, because financial system is global. And no matter what Mr. Trump thinks about China, the global trade system is global. No matter what people think about transportation, you can reach Perth in Australia in 17 hours from London, and this is a big village we are living in. So from many points of view, we are global, but we do not have the toolkit of solution of some of global problems, because we still try to be on the national basis, solving them nationally. That's bad, but it's not not a doomsday. And I can mention to you not only our forum, which is for the second consecutive year is trying to bring some bottoms-up solutions for the global governance and multilateralism, but also I should point out to the UN 75 system, which is worked out when throughout the 2020, United Nations, through all its agencies, together with NGOs, together with national governments, will be working out the system which will be rules-based, norms-based, working out the standards of those global governance, which would be the fact of life for us for years to come.
But you put your finger on the problem, isn't it, that we have a time when there is a rise of nationalism and a retreat from some of the multilateral organizations. And Julius, I think be interesting to hear from you about the US decision, for example, to withdraw from the Paris climate deal. These sorts of rejections of multilateral efforts to guarantee collective action are very representative of our times. Is this a problem? Is this how do you see that? That's that set of issues.
I think some of the other panelists here have represented nationalism as turning back the clock. I think the people who are trying to still stay in the 1990s ideology of globalization are the ones who can't admit that the clock has moved on. And I, for example, am a great supporter of the current president of Mexico, Mr. López Obrador, who has been a harsh critic of NAFTA, who has taken measures to exert more state oversight of its petroleum industry, and Mexico itself is facing its own immigration issues, just as the U.S. is. There's no global solution to these problems. They will have to be done within the nation state. Now, of course, there will be international diplomacy, as there always has, and that remains necessary. But when it comes to things, for what one of the main problems is that environmental policy has run up against trade policy historically. So in the U.S., we passed a lot of environmental measures, and all of the companies just offshored their factories to places that did not have the same environmental protections. So in this case, it's precisely the free trade regime that has been contributing to the environmental problems, and which, unless you deal with that free trade regime, you will not be able to impose any of the environmental protections that you seek. This is an internal contradiction within and among the proponents of globalism that I don't think they can solve. The only way to solve it is through restoring national state capacity, and then dealing with and balancing that in traditional international rather than quote-unquote global diplomacy.
But you're not suggesting, surely, that you can attempt to find a global solution to the issue of climate change through national policies alone?
I think that only national states, which are the only entities that actually can exercise real political and economic power, will have to be the originators and the implementers of any environmental policies. And today I would say there's a lot more, there's been a lot more progress made, for example, in China, because the Chinese recognize for their own national and internal interests the need to deal with environmental challenges, rather than a lot of moralizing in Paris or elsewhere. And the politics of climate change have really been quite revealing insofar as it is always offers a warm embrace to global oligarchs while putting most of the burden on national lower income populations. And then you should not be particularly surprised when those populations reject it.
Lewis, would you like to step in at that point? You might have some views on this, on those comments.
Well, first, I think that Jurgen brought to the table something important. This is becoming a village, or not too big a village, in which you can go and cross the world in a few hours. So there are issues that cannot be settled by one country alone, and climate change might be one of those. That having been said, there's no question that it is governments that have to deal with it. The question is whether they coordinate or not. So in a way, even though multilateral organizations are losing out in their ability to influence decisions, it is multilateral decisions or institutions that have to be able to coordinate these actions. The only way in which, following Julius's example, in which China would be willing or capable to address climate issues is if they can cut a deal with other countries, and that's what multilateral entities or forums are meant to do.
Do you think we should make a distinction between the complaint against globalization and the complaint against multilateralism? Because they're not the same phenomenon, and in some ways multilateralism is an answer to globalization. How do you see the sort of the complaint in the anti-globalist or nationalist proposition? What's the complaint really against?
Well, philosophically, first of all, there will be no nation states one of these days because of this small village, because of many other things. So from this point of view, globalism is inevitable, and this paroxysm of nationalism, of Trump style, Putin style, Brazilian style, is just a paroxysm of nationalism. It's fighting against the inevitable. Well, let them keep fighting. It's legitimate. They're elected. But globally, we will be global. That's number one, if we have to survive. Second of all, in the short term, I agree with you that multilateralism and globalism are different things. For example, we're now facing two existential threats. The threat of the nuclear war, which will annihilate the whole of mankind, and, for example, the threat of environment, which by 2050, if we don't do something, then, for example, the countries like Italy or France will have severe problems, and the country like Estonia will not exist anymore. That's more or less scientific fact. Okay? So these two can be solved only through multilateral effort. If in the Cold War, United States and Soviet Union could solve it bilaterally, now with India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia is in the way, Iran is trying to make the same thing, and Japanese are thinking, etc., etc. With so many stakeholders in nuclear arms, you cannot solve them neither nationally nor even bilaterally. It's multilateral effort. On environment, I'm not going even to say things because so many things were already said about the only multilateral decisions. And China is a good example, but China has a lot of pressure, not from within, but from outside. And China will not be doing this just out of a benevolent effort to his own people. We know that. It's external pressure on China, including the countries around, on something has to be done with the, and not so many things were done so far, by the way. Anyway, multilateralism is one thing, and it's a short to mid-term is the only solution for some of the problems. Globalism is inevitable no matter what. The so-called patriots / nationalists in my own country keep accusing everybody who is for the international effort of global governments, global government behind it. We are run from the United States by Masonic, etc. It's stupid. It's childish. It will be short-lived. We will be global anyway.
Julius, in your worldview, as you put it earlier, is there any space for multilateral action at all, or are you really is it a sort of binary reading of the role of multilateralism in resolving any of the issues that we talked about earlier, trade, climate, etc.?
Of course, there's space for multilateralism, and I don't know anyone who's questioned the need for some forms of international cooperation and diplomacy. They're questioning how those things have been used and what policies have been implemented in their name in recent decades. And to pick up on the previous point, even if you got rid of all the national boundaries and national states that currently exist today, you would not do anything to remove the conflict. These conflicts are not simply a question of good or bad will. They're a question of material interests and other things that are much deeper than that. So even if you created a single world government, you would still have deep conflicts among populations. And especially now when the era of the unipolar world is over, the idea that we can accomplish anything through some quote-unquote globalism, as opposed to honest cooperation, compromise, what you could call serious multilateralism between the competing power blocks in the world, the latter is the only option available as far as I can see.
Let's take your point about the sociology of this. Is what we're looking at really a tension between what David Goodhart described as the somewheres versus the anywheres? How does the tension between the winners and the losers of globalization, however you want to categorize it, how does this feed into this whole issue of collective action through multilateralism at a time of sort of suspicion about globalism and globalization?
Well, I'd say three things. One is I think there's too much of a myth about these elites manipulating and imposing their will. What I think has happened is that the relative value of labor and capital has changed radically in the last several years, simply because the ways to produce, the integrated production chains have altered quite radically the way the world develops and brings about manufacturers. A typical car in the 1950s was manufactured from the start to the end in one single plant. Today, that no longer exists. That it crosses opt-in countries in a matter of days or weeks to produce the final product that is delivered with parts produced in Asia, parts in Europe, parts in America. So those things have changed quite radically, and they have, of course, brought about losers and winners. So my guess is what we need to think about is less about those that allegedly are nowhere and those that are stuck to a given place, and think about the real culprit here. The U.S. has suffered much more in industrial terms than many of the European countries because the educational system has been exposed to be rather lousy. It is those kinds of things have to be addressed in order to provide the people with the ability, with the skills to compete in a world that is totally different. The Europeans have been much better at addressing the core issues of globalization and have lost out much less than the traditional industrial towns in the US.
And yet Europe hasn't been spared from this, from the rise of nationalist forces, the populism, a sort of desire to retreat from the world as it's been experienced in this period of globalization.
Well, yes and no. The nationalist movements in France, in Germany are there obviously, but they have not been able to win out. The stronger ones, like in Poland, in Hungary, and the like, I guess, can be explained by many factors, but not the same ones. They have not been losing out in terms of production. The Germans have not lost out. So it all depends on where you stand. But the point is that those who have had the ability and the skills to exploit the circumstances have benefited much more than the rest. So my main point is that it is finding ways to spread out the benefits more evenly, the real challenge that we have to face.
Igor, how would you analyze it from a sociological point of view? Is there a basis to this tension to do with the somewheres and the nowheres, or the losers and the beneficiaries of globalization?
This is definitely a historical question which was dealt throughout the history of uneven distribution of the product. And from this point of view, both global thinkers and national thinkers now ask themselves the question, how much is enough? So definitely the distribution of the product at the moment, when 1% owes 70% and the rest of them owns 30%, is not sustainable. But this is the part of the global issue. If we have this world government which runs the global village, it will be either social democratic or conservative. We will all elect, and there will be the stages when we will get through the more equal distribution of the wealth produced by us all, then back to economic efficiency when the individualism will win over collectivism and equal distribution. Those are phases and competition about Justin was talking about. But the problem is that it will not be solved on the national level, because national level is too small nowadays. Through communication revolution, IT revolution, fourth industrial revolution, it will be solved on the international level. What interests me, how do we form this international government? Of course, United Nations system is not ideal, and we know all the weaknesses, including the combination of the United Nations Security Council and all of that stuff. But the question that we have to work out the norms of our common living, we have to work out the standards of our common emissions, ecological standards, social standards, etc., and then to enforce them. Because if you enforce them in the ideal United Kingdom and at the same time in non-ideal Australia, it's totally different, you will have just aggravate the immigration, that's all. Only if you establish the norms and standards of the global togetherness and then enforce them through, call it world government, it's the bright future. It's not for today. We all know the difficulties of this denationalization. But we have a good project of the European Union, which you just mentioned, which denationalized, which delegated to the central power in Brussels a lot of things, and they live better no matter what. There are ECAPs of Orban and Johnson. So what? European Union is the largest entity with $18 trillion GDP, equal to the United States, and live well. And they do build new institutions. So this is a good project, and some better projects are coming. And no matter what President of Mexico being, in the indignation in Trump's policies, or Trudeau does, NAFTA will be a good project, and there will be further projects like this, then united in the one global governance project.
I'm glad you mentioned the European Union, because it is, of course, the world's great laboratory of how to, at the same time, retain a certain degree of control and national sovereignty, but cede and pool sovereignty to the European level at a different time. Julius, how do you look at the European Union and its model for managing that relationship between national and a supranational sovereignty? How does that look from your point of view?
It seems like a complete disaster to me. In particular, the euro currency. The EU itself, that I'm less interested in. That's for Europeans to decide. But the euro currency, in the absence of a fiscal union, doesn't make any sense. Even George Soros would say it doesn't make any sense. And what you've had, someone mentioned Germany not losing its production, and others, ask the Italians how that's worked out for them, and frankly ask France. I would say that, again, you have to go back to the material basis of these questions, and attempting to create a currency union without a fiscal union has produced incredible economic problems and incredible divisiveness, much more divisiveness, frankly, now among Europe than there was in, 1998 or whatever, before the euro was around.
And yet Europe is also one of the parts of the world that has the highest degrees of equality. If you look at equality within nations, it's in many respects a model for how to ensure that there is redistribution through the state and create the sort of inequality, which is one of the issues you raised earlier, Luis.
Yeah, well, clearly the one should not mix the European Union project with the euro currency. Those are two different things, and each has its own reason for existing. And the euro has indeed created havoc in some countries. Who's to blame is a different issue, but ultimately irrelevant. The thing that I believe mars the project is some of the institutions that, as the Brits have repeatedly claimed, force them to do things that are anti-democratic, that people would like to make their own decisions, which is what democracy is supposed to be about, and then there are supranational institutions that force them to do something else. The balance between those two things is critical. But that's, interestingly enough, not a significant issue among the core members of the Eurozone. Simply because they saw the war as a much greater evil, and this settles that. Whether the bureaucracy can be watered down, whether it can be addressed, I think are things that the Europeans ought to be facing. I don't think they are learning the lesson from the British decision or attempt to break away. But nonetheless, the key, I think, is not to mix the euro with the European project. Those are two different things, because it has delivered pretty good results, actually. If one looks at the Eastern European countries, they were given a project, they were given a toolkit, and they actually came together and brought about, or are very quickly becoming as developed and as successful as the rest of the Europeans. The Poles and the Hungarians may quarrel, but their standards of living have been rising dramatically over the past 20 years.
I have to congratulate you for not mentioning the word Brexit. I'm always sort of thrilled if you could manage to get through an entire panel without that word being raised. So I've raised it myself. this is a huge subject, and we're sort of roaming around so many different aspects of it. I think one of the purposes of this forum is to try and look at solutions and try and find ways in which multilateral action can be reinforced, collective action can be strengthened. Some of the things we've been talking about, the voices of those who don't feel that they are captured in multilateral action. How sort of looking forward is it possible to take into account the concerns of those who feel that they are exposed by the very concept of sort of the open world and any of these processes we're talking about? How can you capture those voices, integrate them, give people a sense that actually multilateral action is in their interests rather than something that threatens them?
Well, first of all, there are NGO efforts like this, Peace Forum. There are more elitist efforts of Davos, which also is very impressive. Davos is not just the gathering of elites. Between the two Davos sessions, the institutes work, do the interesting analytical and proposals and programs and projects. And then I mentioned this UN 75. UN 75 means that it's a 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and Gutierrez, new Secretary General, announced this multi-institutional effort to unite all think tankers, academia, NGOs, United Nations family, which is 30-odd organizations, and national governments to come together and to think exactly about what you are saying. That is to say, on the multi-sectoral level, to work out the instruments, first of all, to let people know that they're not losing, they're gaining. That's statistically so. We have less wars and ethnic conflicts since 1945 than ever in our history, less victims than ever after 45, etc., etc. We took millions of people out of poverty, like China, some countries in Africa, and so on and so forth. Russians never lived as good as they live now today, etc. So just showing what has been done, collecting this knowledge, because from International Labour Organization, which works on the labor standards, to UNESCO, which works on the educational standards, down to World Meteorological Organization, down to the UN alone, we created already a lot of standards and rules of the game that keeps us together and keeps us going forward against nationalism and fascism, because nationalism, at the end of the day, ends up in fascism, in xenophobia, in killing other people. So there's no question about that, that we're going to go forward and not backward. The way backward is the way to the very serious ethnical and social conflict, and not the way forward. And not a single national government can solve cyber, can solve nuclear war, nuclear armaments problem, ecological problem, or immigration problem. So from this point of view, we have to gather all of this on NGO level, academia, governments, and then United Nations, come together, work out the standards, and work out how do we do this together, and what circle of people and institutions will analyze it and come with some kind of a recipe and solution.
But also in a way that people who feel threatened by this sort of action can feel reassured. I mean, isn't that also part of what we're really trying to talk about here?
It is a very difficult question, because how Macron and Le Pen will live together, how I can live with Farage if I move to Great Britain, it's a good philosophical question for me, because I hate the guts of the fellow, and I think that he's wrong, he's a liar, and all of that stuff, and I can continue, but that's personal, situational, and historically very short-lived. These things can be explained, should be explained, and the aid to people should be delivered. Not like Trump cuts up the international aid, or somebody else. I'm not saying that the Trump is the only villain in our house. That can be done through multilateral effort first, and then through global one second.
Julius, solutions. Where do you stand on some of these questions that I've been raising here about how to, what's the way in which to speak to people who feel threatened by the world that we're living in, but in a way that can also create an outcome that is for the greater global interest?
I actually think that the rise of national populism, for lack of a better word, opens up a lot of new areas for international cooperation. They're just not the ones that the billionaires typically promoting these things like. For example, on taxation and tax evasion. That, on the personal side, you can go back to the U.S. FATCA legislation, which is actually a unilateral effort, but that then, in its wake, there was a larger OECD programs to deal with that. And today, the biggest problem is probably on the corporate side, the tax evasion measures adopted by multinational corporations, which most nations have tried to deal with. It's a huge problem that actually reduces the scope of state sovereignty because they cannot impose the tax and redistribution policies that their people may actually want. And the opposition to that is not coming from U.S. Right-wing nationalists. The other issue would be sort of dealing with the cyber issues, the big tech monopolies. Again, the populists in the United States are not a fan of Facebook. If Europe wants to take harsher actions on some of those, I don't think that they will get a lot of opposition from U.S. nationalist constituencies. And I think in general that in its present incarnation, what we're calling nationalism is actually quite a bit more modest than globalism. It's not saying that we need to create a whole new world. It's even fairly, in America, it's even fairly skeptical of things like American exceptionalism. What it's saying is that we're a normal country, you're a normal country, we have interests, we have to deal with them, and we can't just, if you disagree with me, you're not a bad actor, you're not an evil person, you don't hate, whatever. It's just an honest recognition of interest. So I think that in a lot of ways, even though it's not obvious now given the unique personal natures of some of the proponents of these movements, but this actually opens up a space for a lot more cooperation in certain areas.
Luis, perhaps you can come back on some of those points, but also on this question that I'm trying to push, which is what's missing for policymakers to try to convince people that multilateral action is in their interest as well as the collective interest.
Igor made a very important point earlier, which is that this is not really, globalism and globalization are not really optional. And they are driven mostly by technological change. We're yet to receive the next big blow once 3D printing becomes much more generalized. Many of the things that bother some people, particularly about trade, are going to vanish simply because 3D printing is going to alter the way we do everything within a decade or two. So what I think is really missing is the kind of positive leadership that could lead to the building of the capacity to deal with these problems. We've seen the negative leadership that has emerged in any number of countries, from Russia to the US to Britain to Hungary, whatever, to Turkey. But we have not seen the kind of positive leadership proposing, building, developing, and helping people to become capable of dealing and addressing the problems of today. So the solution cannot be simply leaders, but it is leadership that will make it possible to deal with these kinds of problems.
Can the solution come from outside the political system? That's to say, through the various movements that we've seen, Extinction Rebellion, Occupy, I mean, the number of sort of movements that are coming up from the ground rather than through the political system.
Sure. Igor also mentioned that. The fact is that as information spreads out, as information remains and will become even more ubiquitous and more people will be part of it, it'll have to come from society, from NGOs, from academia, from everybody. And my point about leadership is that something or somebody has to be able to bring this together in order to produce positive results. but the alternatives and the solutions will come from below, clearly, because that's where the problems really are, and that's who understand how to deal with them. It's a matter of governments to provide the conditions, the medium, the infrastructure, the skills, and so on, for that to be possible.
Just before I ask Igor a last question, I wanted to let everyone know that we're going to have 15 minutes for questions and answers afterwards. So if you've got some questions that you'd like to put, you can start thinking about those now. Igor, the relationship between political leadership and civil society or grassroots movements, where is this attempt to try and either alert the world to the issue and do something about it in terms of collective action? Where is that going to come from?
Let me give you an example of Russia, which is not classical democracy at all, which is more of an authoritarian country with some elements of democratic institutions being built for 30 years. There is not a single major national problem which Mr. Putin can solve without experts, civic society people, business organizations, unions, and stuff like that. So on any bifurcation point of our present history, there are all kind of forums trying to get some ideas, trying to find solutions, and then some of those, with the exception of army and security, which is close to us, all other solutions are being taken in some kind of a consultation, not because they like us up there in the Kremlin, but because they cannot find some solutions without some. And as Louis said, the more we are in the internet, the more we are able to live without our government. I know the generation of my daughter, which doesn't know who is the prime minister. She knows that Putin is forever, and she mixes up president and Putin as a term. She thinks that Putin is president, president is Putin. So who else? Because he's there for 20 years. But otherwise, she manages to live without the government. She manages through this internet, through connections, through her own abilities, with some Papa's aid, of course, to live without it. So my answer to your question is that the more we are independent of everyday tutelage from the governments in terms of technology, investment, capital, even job creation, the more they depend on us than vice versa. And that will be seen in the next generation. I agree with Louis 100%. Technological revolution plus IT revolution will make us different. When I worked for President Medvedev, he was playing with the idea of direct democracy. He was promoting the idea of canceling the election by going to ballot by the internet election. And I don't think that it will be totally vain idea in the future. And then you don't need this much of a bureaucracy. What's the problem of the European Union? One and only: bureaucracy. In Brussels, they run us. In Great Britain, we cannot tolerate it. Romanians are running us through the parliament. There will be no such thing. There will be no such thing between the people and those who govern.
And obviously there are some subjects. I mean, we've talked. This is such a huge subject, and it's easy to lose the distinctions between the different topics here. But I mean, there are some subjects that are particularly open to being resolved on the civil society level. I mean, the way in which people behave over use of plastics, or their everyday environmental behaviour, is something that's very different to some of the other issues we're talking about. I think we'll take some questions now because I'm conscious of time and I'm being prompted to take questions. So if you'd like to put your hand up, we have microphones that will move around. So we'll start with the gentleman there and then the lady at the back.
Oui, bonjour, Christophe Guerrero, soldat de la paix. Je me pose la question, quelles sont toutes ces rébellions dans tous les pays dans le monde? Le Chili, la France, l'Espagne. tout ça. Je voudrais bien savoir qu'est-ce que vous en pensez et qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire pour rétablir la paix.
Gosh, that's a big question. Would anyone like to reply? How about Igor? I'm going to offer you up.
As Julius rightly said, there will always be conflict because people, some feel stronger, some feel more beautiful than the other. There will be animosity between the neighbors, and so on and so forth. So, in this global village, if we set up the standards for the democratic behavior of the local chiefs, like in Chile, Bolivia, some other countries, then there will be no such problem. There will be law enforcement, which comes not from the country, but from above, and that's about it. But this is the simple answer to your question. Denationalization and desovereignization will take some time, but it will happen nevertheless. Why there is revolt in Chile or Bolivia? Because they cheat on something. Cheating is no good. But the conflict of this kind might happen in any country, in the governorship in Côte d'Azur or in Siberia, and the president ousts the governor and there is no revolt, right? When it goes out of the certain limit in terms of numerical strength of those who feel offended, then it goes out in the open and changes the government. It doesn't change anything in my idea of the global governance. It will be regional conflict in Chile because the local chief does not behave itself. So what? If the matrix showed that he surpassed his authority or field of competence, there will be world police which comes and ousts him, and that's it. Chilean people are quiet.
The lady at the back has a question.
Oops. Thank you very much. My name is Simone Filippini. I'm a former Dutch diplomat. I've also led two NGOs. I've been politically active, and I say this because then you have a little bit of the context where I come from. Of course, we now have the global agenda of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which you could say if they are being achieved at national level and we're still dealing with national states, despite Mr. Yurgens' the globalization dream, if the results are being produced at national level, we will have basically results at global level. So in a sense, you could say it's fulfilling your dream there, but those results are not coming. The Secretary General of the UN has, even yesterday, I think, he rang the bell that we have serious backlog on the SDG achievement, even we have reverse development. Some of the SDGs are doing worse than before. So we deal with those national governments, but they don't produce the results. And why don't they? And why don't we really invest in the quality of national governance? How can it be that CEOs and boards of corporates are being trained and coached, but there's no support system at all for personal leadership development skills and peer coaching maybe of governments? That's, by the way, what I'm trying to plug into this international development and international community market, leadership for the SDGs. I would like to hear your view on this.
Luis, would you like to answer that?
I'll take a stab. I think that the real challenge is that the functions of government are absolutely critical, but the power of governments has been waning and will continue to wane. How does one match those two things is I think, the biggest challenge for the future. Many countries abandon their functions, and that's what I think produced the revolts, the strongman governments, and the like. But the functions of government, in terms of law enforcement, in terms of peace, in terms of services and the like, remain and will remain forever. Those are absolutely fundamental for the functioning of a society. So, in the context of a global arena, where there are supranational entities and multilateral bodies, how does one balance the needs for local government action and the costs and needs of a global world that demands solution to problems that are well beyond any government or any country?
We've got 3 questions. We'll go to the gentleman there, and then the lady there, and then there's a lady at the back. Sorry, gentleman in the middle there.
Thank you very much. I'm Bertrand de Kronberger from Belgium. Conventional wisdom has it that to have a democracy, you need to have an area delimiting territory, people, and forming a government where democracy can express itself. If it is true that the borders disappear, that government lose their hold on the issues, what does this promise in terms of democratic governance? Is the panel then in agreement that this is a lost cause?
I don't think the panel's yet in agreement on anything, by the way, but that aside, Igor, and then I must like to bring Julius in again at some point.
It's a fantastic question from Belgium, which is the world champion in running the country without the central government for 1 year, and nobody noticed that there is no government in Brussels. Okay, this is a fantastic case of local authority being run by the people who are elected and so on and so forth. But I agree with you that for this you have a certain level of civilization, culture and education for centuries, and you cannot immediately reproduce it in some parts of Siberia, for example. I agree with that. But this is a fantastic example how we can do it on the local level and then delegate democratically to the higher. I'm not saying that there will be an anarchy, so no governments at all. All I'm saying is that we're becoming such a small village that to solve any of the problems of Oklahoma just by the central government in Washington is stupid. It should be done someplace from higher up, as well as in Moscow and Siberia or Mexico City.
Should we take the question there, and then I'm from the lady, like, exactly.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jimena from Mexico. I was wondering what's your view on movements such as the one inspired by Greta Thunberg, and is it a reflection of how multilateral organized efforts have failed and how ordinary citizens have taken action into their own hands?
Thank you. Julius?
I would be surprised if we're talking about that in more than a few months. I would like to go back to the issues of democracy and globalization. There are 2 potential ways, really, to do globalization. One is you have a real world state, and you have a real global demos, global electorate. That has not happened, and I don't think it's realistically possible, certainly not in any of our lifetimes, and probably never been done. The other way, the way that we have pursued globalization, is basically used it as the moralizing ideology for global neoliberalism, a way to weaken states, weaken state capacity, and impose a neoliberal economic order across the world. That is what is breaking down, and I think the solution will involve, at some level, restoring state capacities, and that inevitably means national states.
Thank you, Julius. I think that we need an answer nonetheless to the question that was asked. Would either of you like to have a go at that? Greta Thunberg.
What happens in this era is that people can be empowered, and there are the means for them to take a global stage. It may last long, it may not, but those are the kinds of things that, as communications and as information spreads out and the ability to tap them increases, there will be many more. And those will be calls, whether they are heeded, whether they have an impact, is, I think, an open question.
I mentioned that our government cannot, even in spite of being very authoritarian with the law enforcement, with the prison, going to prison for something, they cannot solve some of the issues. And Greta showed us how through social networks and IT revolution, the direct democracy can work. From this point of view, direct democracy of Greta style does resonate in Baikal, which is being polluted by both Russian and Chinese. And this is the global demo, which will directly elect its global government.
Thank you. The lady there in the third row, had her hand up, and then the gentleman in the front row.
Thank you very much for an excellent panel. My name is Adriana Abdenur. I'm the International Security Coordinator of Igarapé Institute in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And my question regards countries such as mine, which are undergoing strong national populism under a far-right government led by military. We see declining space for civil society. We see attempts to criminalize not only NGOs and think tanks, but also researchers who work on particularly sensitive topics, such as climate. And yet we are also part of multilateralism. So what is your advice on how civil society can boost multilateralism from below? Thank you.
The simple question,
Igor, thank
Lula
you.
is out, you'll be back to normal, but that's too simple and simplistic. I would say that Brazilian people will fight for freedom and democracy like everybody else. If we are in the position to accept like an axiom that freedom is better than non-freedom, then freedom instrumentalized by technical revolution will win over autocrats. Today in Brazil, Mr. Putin, Mr. Xi Jinping, your chairman, president, excuse me, and South African guy gets together at the BRICS summit, okay? So those are people absolutely democratically, some of them, and not so democratically elected by. So at the moment they are needed by the population, but very soon people like yourself, from what you said, will realize that this is not the way to move Brazil forward. Or the same for Russia, the same one of these days for China. So freedom is better than non-freedom, and people will prove it.
It's an important question. Luis, do you want to add anything to that?
Just one point, the famous Benjamin Franklin quip: if people don't defend what they've been able to, what benefits them and what has given them the freedoms, then they will lose out. So the question is, when do they begin to realize that they are losing out? And it's the people that will defend against over-empowered governments. I don't think there's any other solution.
Thank you. The gentleman in the front row.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Gabriel. I'm an international relations student here in Paris. I simply wanted to ask what you think about the effects of social media in shaping the opinions in favor of globalism or anti-globalism, because the effects of social media became extremely important, and it always seems to me that it's way easier to advocate nationalism within 280 characters than it is to advocate multilateralism. So I just wanted to ask you what you thought about this.
Thank you. Who would like to answer that? Julius, do you want to have a go at that one?
I think this is an issue that actually can unite everyone. Everyone is, after initial wave of fanfare about how social media would bring us all together and lead us to the new promised land, I think everyone, right, left, center, has come to recognize that this is a new and fairly toxic form of social interaction mediated entirely by private monopolies. And the solutions to that have not yet been found, but I think everyone at least recognizes the problem.
Sure. Igor, why don't you have a go, and then we'll have one last question from the gentleman in the front row.
I only have to repeat that, of course, social media sometimes is used by demagogues, nationalists, fascists, and also by very progressive people, etc., etc. These are the cross-section of us. That's the new tool given to people, that's all. Otherwise, great French Revolution started by Danton, then through Thermidor, killed all the revolutionaries, brought back Napoleon, and all of that. That probably will repeat itself. But at that time, people could not pronounce because they didn't have means. Now, everybody had their means. We have to listen to that. And that brings us to an absolutely new level of global demo.
But it remains a point clearly that it's a lot easier in 240 characters to make a sharp point in favour of that appeals to sort of the nationalist feeling than it is to promote.
And the opposite is true also, because any action provides interaction, right? Counteraction. That's the physics. So there will be a demagogic 240. There will be reasonable backlash.
We've got time for one more question. There's a gentleman in the front row there, and then we'll wrap up.
Voilà, merci. Je m'appelle Marcel Assens Malumba Mboui de la Redondance TV. En fait, ma question, c'était juste, on a parlé de l'Union européenne et de l'État économique européen qui est en perte de vitesse aujourd'hui. Et par rapport à ça, je ne sais pas, le pays tels qu'ils sont conçus ici en Europe, comment on voit leurs intérêts, ils voient leurs intérêts économiques, mais ils oublient parfois l'Afrique, qui est aujourd'hui le continent le plus pourvoyeur en matières premières. Et nous voyons comment les matières premières sont exploitées en Afrique. En République démocratique du Congo, par exemple, nous voyons qu'il y a des enfants qui sont exploités et qui sont dans des mines envoyées en train d'exploiter à main nue des minéraux qui font que l'Europe puisse se développer avec la nouvelle technologie. Mais que pensez-vous de cette exploitation? Parce que l'Afrique est aujourd'hui considérée comme étant un continent poubelle. Que pensez-vous que l'Afrique puisse faire pour que on ne puisse plus avoir ces déséquilibres plutôt entre États qui feront que aujourd'hui, comme nous constatons que l'Union européenne est en perte de vitesse, pour que l'Afrique puisse aussi remonter la pente.
Thank you. Lewis, Africa being exploited by Europe, and in particular in the case of child labour.
Well, I think that has been a traditional charge by all underdeveloped countries. Latin America shows that once countries begin to assume responsibility, they begin to develop themselves, and that entails developing their own policies that address their domestic issues rather than blaming everybody else. And that's been true throughout the Americas forever. And certainly Asia. I don't see any reason why Africa will not be able to change that. If one looks at East Africa, that's clearly happening, and happening very quickly from South Africa through the coast of the Pacific.
Thank you very much. Right, it is exactly on time. I think we're going to wrap up now. Thank you very much indeed. I'm not going to try and produce a summary of this conversation because I don't think that would be actually technically, logistically or philosophically possible. But there's plenty of food for thought, and I hope you all got something to go home with about when we're thinking about collective action and role of multilateralism in trying to bring about the change that we're discussing here today at the Paris Peace Forum. So thank you very much to my guests, and thank you all for listening.